Welcome everybody to our last in the series of our winter speaker riparian regulations, exploring stewardship and the things we need to know about riparian areas and regulations. So welcome to all of you joining us from wherever you might be. My name is Noreen Ambrose. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction and then we'll move on to our speakers. So as you may have seen in that introductory reel that was running, we're offering this series throughout February and March and in partnership with the Environmental Law Center. So some of you may have attended the previous weeks. And before we start, I just want to welcome everybody from wherever you're coming, but I particularly want to take a moment to do a First Nations acknowledgement. We are hoping to reach people from across the province, and our series is intended to reach and talk about things across Alberta. So we want to acknowledge that we are in traditional territories on Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8, traditional territory of many different First Nations across Alberta. If you're participating from some other location, please take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and in. And also acknowledge we also acknowledge the Métis Nation and many other nations, First Nations that have tramped, walked, ran, and moved across these places for centuries and millennia. And those footsteps before us, of course, have resulted in First Nations community having experience and knowledge gained from that long history in these places, including connections to the land and the water, which we want to acknowledge tonight. And particularly because our topic is beavers, for numerous First Nations, beavers are a sacred animal. So we want to acknowledge that as well. That connection to the land and the water, we hope we're going to share with you tonight as well, in terms of understanding how to better understand these creatures, how we can coexist with them. So thank you for those joining us from First Nations communities and everyone else. If you haven't joined us before, we have been offering this series, as I mentioned, throughout the last month and a bit, and offering repeat sessions Wednesdays and Thursdays on the same topic. We will be posting tonight's session in a couple of days on our YouTube channel. So if you miss it all at the end, you miss any pieces, you want to refer to it again or pass it on to other people, we encourage you to do that. So the other topics which you'll be able to find on our YouTube channel and are already there are riparian restoration and bank stabilization, livestock crossings of waterways, and responsible recreation, minimizing your impact. Again, always with the lens of riparian stewardship and regulations, things you need to know from a regulatory perspective when working in, doing restoration or management or land use activities related to those topics. So if you're a bit new to Zoom, you'll note that you don't have video function and your audio is off if you're joining us as a participant. Only our panelists have that function. You do have, however, a chat function, which we encourage you to use and refer to. There'll be lots of additional content being posted in there by our panel to share links on the different regulatory aspects. So you can find that information throughout the evening. There's also a Q&A or question and answer box, which we'd like you to put your questions in. So that is generally, for most of you, at the bottom of your screen, both the chat function, which is kind of like a single little comment bubble, and the Q&A, which is two little comment bubbles attached with a Q&A in it. So please, again, put your questions in the Q&A box and put other kinds of commentary you'd like to share in the chat function. And you can send those to the panelists only if you wish, or you can put them so that the panelists and all other attendees can see it, and that's up to you. If you are attending and don't know already who the Environmental Law Center and Cows and Fish are, I work for the Cows and Fish organization, and our mission is to promote healthy landscapes through riparian stewardship. And that's really complementary to the work that the Environmental Law Center does, because their mandate is about educating and championing for strong environmental laws and rights so that we can have clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment. So really a good fit for us to partner together, and we are so glad to be able to do this. Most of you already probably know what a riparian area is because you've been on other sessions with us or knew beforehand. But for those that aren't really familiar, a riparian area is that piece of the landscape that's near water. It's the edge of the lake, the stream, the river, or the wetland that's got extra moisture because of its proximity to a water body. It might be dry, doesn't have to have surface water at all times. It could be a spring or a seep or an ephemeral water body like a wetland or a small coulee draw that has more water than the rest of the landscape. So it can be hard to see in the boreal forest because there's lots of moist areas everywhere, and they are abundant across our landscape, but in Alberta, 2 to 5% of the settled landscape is riparian. So they're pretty special for their relatively small size. And part of that is keeping them healthy and understanding where they are, including the regulations that you want to know about if you're doing work or activities in these places, which is why we're hosting the series. So riparian areas, if they're healthy, perform a whole bunch of functions like trapping sediment and recharging groundwater and resisting erosion. But when we influence these places, they can also lose those abilities. So maybe we're trying to restore those abilities, or we want to think about our actions and activities so that we don't reduce their function. We want to keep them healthy. It might be that sites have lost some of those functions. There's bare ground, loss of vegetation, compacted soils, downcutting or erosion of the actual water body so the water no longer connects to the land. Regardless of what the reason might be, whether it's accidental and we're trying to repair it, or it's a long history of different kinds of use, we want to understand the regulations when we're working in these places. And those regulations can be a bit daunting at times and complex. So if this image makes you feel uncomfortable, or gives you angst, hopefully tonight's session and the other sessions we've held through the series will help you understand a bit more about what you do need to know, and also share some successful case studies about things that you might want to think about working through. What are the different aspects that are likely needed that other people have already are going to share as part of this series, and that can help take away some of that scariness. We've already talked about riparian restoration and working in recreational activities, bank stabilization, those kinds of topics. Much of the regulatory pieces may be similar, but we'll try to provide examples that make it relevant to each kind of activity that we're talking about each evening or afternoon. And so tonight, we're going to be talking about beaver coexistence, more of which you'll hear about in a little bit. And we're hoping to do a future session on offsite watering and water developments, excuse me, and we did another one on livestock crossings. So again, look for our YouTube channel to see more about that. You might ask, why are we working on beaver coexistence? Well, we know that beavers are often in water bodies and therefore in and around riparian areas, and they can cause lots of challenges. So things like flooded culverts or plugged culverts, flooding roads, all those kinds of challenges that they cause mean we also need to deal with those challenges. So we're going to talk about some of those techniques and how to deal with them beyond this sort of traditional way, which might have been, blowing up beaver dams, things like bringing in heavy equipment to get rid of the dam that's causing flooding somewhere, or even more other techniques like lethal removal, trapping, hunting. Not that all of these techniques aren't still going to be needed in some situations potentially, but again, looking at what are the other kinds of techniques and what are the regulatory considerations. Some of those are kind of engineering, technical kind of solutions, but others are a little less big picture and more hands-on. So things like beaver-proof culverts we're not going to talk about tonight, but we will talk about some other kinds of techniques. So the first thing we'd like you to do to just get used to using the kind of technology we have with us is the polling. So you'll see a poll that asks you to describe yourself. Which of the categories best describes you? Please fill it out. And when you're done, you just hit submit. And you'll see that if the box pops back up when we're sharing it, if it's still in your way, you just have to close it by touching the little X in the top right. So please tell us who you are today. And once you've done that and hit submit, please also go into the chat function and tell us, where are you from? So just a few more people, if you wouldn't mind filling in the poll just to give us a sense of who's attending today, that would be great. So it looks like we have 16, 13, a few more people filling it out. That's great. It looks like we have municipal government, non-government organizations, acreage consultants, quite a mixture, so that's great. Thank you for all attending tonight. And again, tell us where you're from in the chat box, just to give, it helps us understand a little bit more about who's attending and makes it seem like there's real people in the same room with you, even though we're in a digital world these days. So we're going to start off with our agenda now. Again, my name's Noreen Ambrose with Cows and Fish, and I'm pleased to introduce our speakers tonight. Our first speaker will be Jason Unger, followed by 2 case studies from Tanya Lewinsky and Holly Kinnis, and I'll tell you a bit more about them next. But I'll ask Jason to just turn his camera on and come on live and get his presentation up and running while I introduce him. So welcome, Jason.
Thanks very much.
So Jason's presentation is called Industrious Beavers Dam Law. And you'll notice that Jason's got a bit of a punny sense of humor throughout his talk. And he is the executive director and the general counsel for the Environmental Law Centre, which is an Alberta-based charity focused on legal education and environmental and natural resources law reform. He has practiced in a lot of areas, including issues on water law, legal tools for conservation on private lands, environmental assessment law, species at risk, as well as pollution prevention. And prior to working with the Environmental Law Centre, he did practice in the sort of public or the private practice sector in both Edmonton and Calgary, including in front of the Alberta Court of Queen's Bench, the Alberta Court of Appeal, and Natural Resources Conservation Board. So lots of practical experience. And Jason also sits as a board member on the Alberta Water Council, which is a multi-stakeholder organization that provides advice and input on provincial water policy in Alberta. So with that introduction, please take it away, Jason, and your presentation looks great.
Thanks very much, Noreen. Get a bit of reverb there, but I think it goes away quite quickly. So yes, beavers and the law. They do give a great opportunity for some bad puns, so be warned. So I'm going to be talking about how beavers and the natural world and water interact with our legal system. And really, when we talk about beavers and the law, one has to wonder who, if we're talking about justice, who weighs more, the beaver or the legislation? And perhaps we can discuss that in the Q&A session after all our speakers today. So when we talk about water-loving rodents, we're talking about the beavers themselves, we're talking about the dams, and of course the water that they hold back, and we're talking about the habitat they inhabit. And when we talk about those things, it instantly triggers the application of a variety of sources of law. So that could be provincial law in the form of public lands legislation, the Water Act, or the Wildlife Act in the province. If there's fish or fish habitat or habitat that is important for fisheries, the Fisheries Act under the federal legislation might apply. And even in the common law, there may be implications of the actions of beavers on the landscape and how it interacts with the law. So where water law lodges, another pun, sorry. Really the function of our water law in Alberta and in Canada is an interaction of land and water connections. It's a complex area because of that. We know that water runs everywhere, whether we want it there or not. Sometimes we want it there, sometimes we want to get rid of it. And obviously the water plays a function, ecological function for fisheries, for aquatic systems, for land, of course, as well. So the Canadian Constitution is a big part of that. The federal government has clear jurisdiction under our Constitution on inland and coastal fisheries, as well as around navigation. So that we have federal legislation in that regard, whereas the province has a clear role around natural resources within the province and crown lands that are owned by the province, as well as around issues of property rights and civil rights of people who live there. And then we also have the common law. And the common law is basically judge-made law that has evolved through time. A lot of it has evolved in Britain first, and then when settlers came, colonized Canada, they brought the British law with them. And we'll talk about that and the implications of that are brought forward today in our water law today. So in terms of water use and some of the actions we take on water, the foundation of it is in riparian rights. The notion that if you own parcel A and a river runs by it, you have the ability to divert that water at common law and use it. You cannot divert all of it because you have to leave the amount for downstream riparian owners. Similarly, you can't pollute the water in such a way that downstream owners can't use the water. So a riparian right was a right, but it was also an obligation not to degrade the water or to remove too much water. So it was a reasonable use. The common law in this regard was a problem for Canada when the West was settled, and particularly for Alberta, where the South is quite arid. And it was recognized that if you were the owner of parcel B in the figure in this slide, you had no water. You had no water rights. And therefore, why would you move to somewhere where you had no water rights? So it was a big challenge, and that's why a lot of the common law system was taken over by our legislation. But of course, then comes the industrious one, the Beaver, and they go in and dam the riparian, the river or stream. Of course, then next thing you know, A may not be a riparian owner anymore, and B all of a sudden is in good shape. So in this way, the Beaver is kind of the arbiter of our property rights vis-a-vis the water and the control they have over the water. And if you own property where beavers have had an impact, you recognize that clearly. So rights to navigation and fishing. So the public right to navigation and fishing comes from our common law in Britain. And there's a presumption that not only is the water owned by the Crown, but the bed and shore of the water bodies are owned by the Crown too. This recognized that if activity was going to impact the bed and shore, then it might interfere with a fishing right or a navigation right that the public had at large. Again, this was adopted into federal legislation in 1894 in the Northwest Irrigation Act, and it carries forward to the provincial laws of today. So if we look back when we colonized Canada as settlers, and we brought a certain specific type of law, and we deeded a bunch of land to the Hudson's Bay Company, which of course Beavers and the Hudson's Bay Company are closely related, not only in branding, but in the beaver pelts that they did with the fur traders and the trappers, and sent those back for top hats and such. So there was the Rupert's land basically was the state of affairs back in the 1600s. That gave way to a deeding of land back to the federal government, and so that the federal government had a large role to play in and around the 1900s. Alberta becomes a province in 1905, and importantly, the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement of 1930 transferred a bunch of the resources that were formerly federally controlled to Alberta. And in 1931, the Water Resources Act came into play. And that confirmed Crown ownership of the water and the bed and shore. So the bed and shore and the ownership thereof is in the Public Lands Act. So it's not in the Water Act. The Water Act states now, as my next slide will show, that the Crown still owns the water, whereas the Public Lands Act sets out that the permanent and naturally occurring beds and shores of water bodies, as well as the naturally occurring lakes, rivers, streams, are owned or vested in the Crown. There are a few pieces of bed and shore out there that aren't owned by the Crown, and those are typically related to lands that were deeded to the railways prior to the codification of the Crown ownership. So there are a few out there, but they're not too many, and clearly that would take some historical research to figure out which is which. So if we look at water law today, and of course this is highly relevant for beavers because we're always trying to manage where the water is going and where the dams, or how to manage the dams and that type of thing, and the impacts on the beds and shores of public land or of these water bodies. So the Water Act, for instance, the property in and the right to divert the use of all water in the province is vested in the Crown. Now, under current law, this is a renewable kind of license you can get under the Water Act. The Public Lands Act, as I mentioned earlier, also says that the title to the beds and shores of all permanent and naturally occurring bodies of water and all naturally occurring rivers, streams, watercourses, and lakes are vested in the Crown. It's important to note here that bodies of water, the phrase bodies of water, has permanent and naturally occurring associated with it. And the government has some policy documents and guidelines around how they determine what is permanent. Whereas related to rivers and streams and watercourses and lakes, you'll see that only naturally occurring applies. So the permanence issue is less applicable to the issue around seasonal streams, rivers, and other types of watercourses. So if we're talking about the beds and shores, where is the line drawn? For instance, if a water body goes by a piece of private land, where is that line of Crown-owned land versus private land? And to survey this, you look to the Surveys Act, and it notes that the land covered by water, so as to remove the vegetation or to make the vegetation of a distinct nature, is where the shore and bed, or mostly the shoreline, is going to be. But of course, with climate and erosion and weathering and accretion, as well as beavers themselves, we know that these shorelines can change through time, through no work of humans or authorizations of government. It's an ever-changing landscape. So what does this all mean? Basically, the Water Act sets out very broad prohibitions related to activities that might have an impact on water and water bodies. Similarly, the Public Lands Act sets out very broad prohibitions against injuring the bed and shore or occupying public land, in which case the Public Lands Act states that that is trespass if you are occupying public land without an authorization or without some type of exemption under the law. So the legal certainty that we seek in our laws is kind of upended by beavers in many ways. As I mentioned many times already, the property and water and the beds and shores are owned by the Crown, but beavers don't care if they get a Water Act approval. Or perhaps a bit more suspiciously, maybe they're operatives of the Crown, where they're gaining property for the Crown by creating bigger beds and shores through their damming. But who's to say? I haven't spoken to a beaver lately, so. So activities under the Water Act, as I said, are prohibited without an approval or other exemption in regulation. And activities is broadly defined to include a disturbance of land with the possible consequence of changes in flow, direction, or quantity, as well as the quality of the water. So it's very broad. So if you're impacting the land to cause siltation or perhaps flooding an adjoining property, those types of activities need an approval. The Water Ministerial Regulation, however, sets out a variety of exemptions to that approval requirement. And this includes one section that says removal of a beaver dam from a water body is allowed if it's adjacent to private land, basically. So if you own and occupy the land adjacent to the Beaver Dam, then you can remove it. Otherwise, there's the ability for, so there's reference in this section to Section 95 of the Water Act, and that relates to how a director can indicate who has that authorization to remove those beaver dams. So as I've mentioned, the Water Act, there's an approval requirement unless it's exempt. So on private land, you can have that exemption apply under the regulation. Whereas the Public Lands Act, there may be the need for different types of authorizations. A license of occupation, if you're actually putting something into public land or leaving on something on public land. There is a provision in the Public Lands Act saying that if you make an improvement on public land, that improvement becomes owned by the Crown as well. There's also a temporary field authorization, which is required if you're removing a dam or a house. And then if we switch gears to the Wildlife Act, again, the Crown owns all live wildlife. Unless there's a permit or authorization in place, there's a variety of restrictions that take place and apply. So a person shall not disturb or destroy a beaver dam in prescribed areas or prescribed times, unless otherwise authorized. So that's the general premise, that you can't destroy a beaver dam unless you're allowed to by the regulations. And of course, again, we see that a beaver can be hunted when it's on privately owned land by either the occupant of the land or somebody authorized by the occupant. And a municipal employee can also be designated as someone to deal with nuisance, what we call nuisance or consider nuisance species like beaver, coyote, squirrels, and that type of thing. In terms of the dam itself, there's protection under the Act for public land-based beaver dams. So if the dam is again on private land, there's basically no protection for that dam under the Wildlife Act. Similarly, the government can issue an order if there's a dam on private land, if it's causing or likely to cause harm to property. Finally, we get to the Fisheries Act. And the Fisheries Act is a very broad piece of legislation where if there is fish or fish habitat, well, usually if there's fish habitat, obviously, but there's a couple of major prohibitions that apply there. First, Section 35(1) is often referred to as the HADD provision, the HADD, meaning basically that you cannot undertake an activity that results or could result in the harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat. And Section 36, which prohibits the releases of substances that are deleterious to fish in waters frequented by fish. So some of the key questions you might ask around the Fisheries Act is whether there's fish or fish habitat around the beaver dam. Is there a risk of habitat alteration or release of sediment in such a way that it's a problem to fish? And is there a change to fish passage by perhaps the activity on the dam itself or in the water body? The federal government does have an interim code of practice for the removal of dams. As will be discussed, that doesn't necessarily mean anything for the types of responses that we're looking for, where we're looking to coexist with beavers. But it is important to note that you still have to comply and mitigate any kind of issues related to harmful impacts on fish habitat. And specifically, the interim code does state that it does not apply. So you can't use the code as a guide where there's a species at risk, or there's critical habitat, or where there's work in the channel or shoreline beyond just breaching the dam, or where explosives are used. The code itself deals with a variety of things around timing, mitigation measures, managing siltation, notification requirements. And if all that is in place, then there could be the possibility of going forward with the removal of Beaver Dam. But for many of the coexistence tools, there may be a need to seek a review as to the impacts on the fish or fish habitat. So that sums up my presentation, and we'll hand it over, well, after a short Q&A, I think we'll hand it over, although I've gone over time quite a bit. We'll hand it over to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jason. There are a plethora of things to keep in mind in regulations, lots of things from many different angles on the beaver front, and either coexisting or other kinds of interactions for sure. So I'm just going to check our Q&A box because it looks like there are a couple possible new questions in there. So can you tell us, Jason, I guess from your perspective, a question that often comes up is, well, how has this been applied, or has anybody seen this happen in Alberta? Any big sort of, I'll say, public issues or case law related to sort of managing beavers, or not managing them, but doing something related to them that you could share with us?
Right. Well, beyond general wildlife kind of control measures and that type of thing, there hasn't been really a lot of decisions or prosecutions around beaver dams, although there is a decision out of BC that dealt with how beaver dams were being drawn down by a railway in one instance. There was a charge laid and a trial in that case. However, the rail line was acquitted because the judge in that case found that they were duly diligent in how they approached it. But there was some harm to fish habitat in that case. So it's an example of what potentially can happen around, if there is fish, there are fish or fish habitat in and around the beaver dams or in that stream. There's the need to get clarity and possibly an authorization, well, oftentimes an authorization, or if you can manage around some of the timing issues that DFO has published, but and right, the other mitigation measures that they publish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Okay, good to know. So yeah, in that case, it was actually maybe trying to remove the damage or the flooding caused by the beavers, and that the regulatory piece was, of course, the Fisheries Act, Federal Fisheries Act. So there is another question for you. So how does the Municipal Government Act influence beaver management? And same thing for the Pest Act. Can you respond? Do you know?
So I'm not, sorry, I get this feedback sometimes. The Pest Act, I cannot respond to that. I think a lot of the, so for instance, under agricultural legislation, if something's deemed a pest, you have a bunch of exemptions. But certainly I think in the general exemptions, there's the ability to control beavers on your land, on private land. Of course, if the beaver is on public land adjoining your land, that becomes a bigger problem. Then you'd have to engage the government to deal with that. But I can't really speak to the Pest Act. The Municipal Government Act, certainly it can influence beaver management, but really a lot of the authorizations are under the Water Act, the Public Lands Act, and that type of thing. There is a general provision in the Municipal Government Act noting that they have direction, management, and control over water bodies. However, that's subject to other enactments. So if you have authorizations or exemptions under other enactments, that would typically apply. But it's always good to look into any types of bylaws that you might think might apply, but I haven't come across any bylaws related to beavers specifically. So yeah. So
thank you, Jason. That makes sense. So and when you say other enactments, that really means other federal and provincial legislation.
Right.
That I'll ask our next speaker, which is Tanya Lewiski, to come forward with her, turn her video on and get her presentation up. So Tanya has been a riparian specialist with Cows and Fish since she joined us in 2018, and she's based out of Edmonton. She comes from a botanical background, so she loves all kinds of plants, big and small, but she does have a soft spot for the native prairie grasses. And she's been helping to educate about beavers, beaver coexistence techniques since she started with cows and fish, and enjoys every opportunity to install coexistence devices, even in the snow, which she may show you a picture of. She appreciates working with beavers and the problems they cause, because they do have such amazing problem-solving skills and work ethic. So that makes them rather inspirational, and they constantly remind her that humans don't know all the answers. So with that, Tanya, welcome. And your presentation is showing up great. You just need to turn your sound on.
That reminder, I was about to start talking without that. Thanks, Noreen, for that introduction. So hello, everybody. I cannot see any of you, but that's okay.
We can see it great, Tanya, but actually your sound seems very muted to me. So perhaps you can turn up your sound or just move a little closer.
How about now? Is that any better?
That's a lot better. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, thanks everybody. I'm pleased to be here today and to share with you a story about beaver coexistence tools and regulations. So Noreen has already given a brief introduction to who we are at Cows and Fish and what the word riparian means. But now, how do beavers fit into this picture? So simply put, beavers and the dams that they make enhance, widen, and create riparian landscapes. So it became apparent early on in Cows and Fish that we can't have a full discussion about riparian areas without also talking about beavers. So beavers are a Canadian icon. They're found on our money, and places are named after beaver in various ways throughout the province and country. So is there anyone here from Beaver County or Beaver Lodge or Beaver Creek, perhaps? But even though beavers are part of our Canadian roots, not everyone always feels all warm and fuzzy about these fuzzy little critters. Beavers can create challenges where their habitat overlaps with ours. So I'm sure everyone has a story or has seen examples of what beavers can do, but there's some photos of beaver challenges, so including flooding of crops, washing out roads and bridges, flooding fences, fields. And Noreen already showed this picture today, but this is something I'm sure everyone has come across once or twice, at least, are these flooded roads. And so this is what the culvert looks like on the inside, which is pretty impressive when you think about the size of the beaver and the size of the culvert. But it's definitely a difficult challenge to manage. So if you've had problems with beavers, your attitude about the beavers are probably to be a little bit more negative than your enthusiastic but untroubled neighbor. And as anyone who's had to deal with beaver knows very well, they can cause a lot of headaches. So why should we tolerate these little critters and the mess that they can make? Understanding the benefits that they can bring is the first step into learning why some people are choosing to coexist with them. So I'm just going to go over a very quick overview of some of these benefits. If you're interested in learning more, please visit our website for more resources. We also offer a longer workshop called Living with Beavers, and it goes more into depth about beaver biology, their challenges, case studies, and more examples of folks learning to live with beavers. So if you're interested in that, please get in touch with either Noreen or I, or speak with us after the presentation today. So among the benefits that beaver provide for us is water storage. So their ponds that they create store a whole lot of water on the landscape. And this water stored means there's more groundwater that's being able to seep into the ground, and that creates greater downstream annual flows. They also impact water quality. The beaver dams and their ponds capture and store a ton of sediment. So at the upper end, this can represent 382 tandem dump trucks stored in each dam. This means that there's cleaner water that's leaving these beaver ponds and traveling downstream. It also can impact water flow. So increasing the velocity of water increases a stream's ability to erode, and then in turn gives the stream more power to carry more of that eroded material and sediment downstream. So beaver dams act like a speed bump. The slower the velocity in the streams with beaver dams, it also means that there's less erosive power, and they can also help moderate flood peaks. And finally, they create biodiversity and habitat. The beaver ponds help cool water for fish, and that helps create habitat for the 80% of species that rely on riparian areas for part or all of their life cycle. And this includes beaver. So they're building their home as much as they're supporting others. And that's a reason why they're one of our keystone species. So beavers can provide many ecological goods and services, but we know that they can also be very busy creatures, and sometimes their actions will conflict with ours. So how do we harness the ecological benefits that they can provide us while minimizing the economic harm that they may pose? This brings us to what we call coexistence tools. These are tools that we use in some areas. They're not going to work in all instances, but this is where we use these tools to try to mitigate the damaging effects of flooding, or to try and deter the damaging behavior in the first place, all while maintaining beaver on the landscape. So I unfortunately don't have time to be going over all these tools in detail. So if you want any more information on any of these, please see our website, the Mastaki website, or get in touch with me, Noreen, or Holly, our next speaker. So these include pond leveling devices. I'm going to be focusing my presentation today mostly on these pond leveling devices, so I will give you more details on that in a little bit. We've got culvert exclusion fences, and so this is a type of fence that you essentially just prevent the beaver from getting into the culvert and damming it up within that culvert. And then you can also have a combination device. So this is where you put a pond leveler and with the outlet end going straight into a culvert exclusion fence. And this is kind of, you can use them in instances where the water level is maybe a little bit lower, or if you're in a kind of an area where it's a little bit tricky to install a fence of the right size, or just if you have some pretty ambitious beavers that just really want to keep blocking up that culvert exclusion fence, which for the most part are designed to not allow beavers to block them up. And then these next two, so the beaver dam analog, as well as the beaver relocation. Those are two coexistence tools that Holly is going to be covering a little bit more in the presentation following this one. And then there's also tree wrapping, sand painting. So exactly what it sounds like, you mix sand with paint and then paint trees with the idea that the grittiness of that sand is going to deter beavers from chopping it down. And then there's providing an alternative food supply. So as I said, today I'm just going to be focusing on our experiences and regulations in installing pond leveling devices. It's our understanding that the regulations for the exclusion fences and combination devices are similar. So what I'm talking about today will also apply to the culvert exclusion fences for the most part. So these are some schematics of pond leveling devices. And so the intent behind the pond leveler is to manage water flows from the beaver dam. And so it allows water to keep flowing. So there's a pipe that we insert into the beaver dam, and it allows water to keep flowing out of the pond, all while retaining that dam in place. So there's a few different designs out there, but these ones are more similar to the types that we have kind of adopted and are using most often. And so here's a close-up of, this is the downstream end. So this is the pipe as it's coming out of the dam. So you can see there's a lot of water that's coming through there, but the dam is still in place. There's no water that's coming over top of the dam, and it's just allowing that water to move through. And this is the upstream end of the dam. So the upstream end is covered with a cage, and this is to make sure that the beaver doesn't get into the upstream end of the pipe and plug it up, as you know they are prone to do. And this is during the installation, so it's just being floated out into its location, and these floats will be pulled when it's in the right location so that the cage and the pipe will sink into the water column. So the case study I'm going to share with you today is an example of a landowner-driven coexistence project within Brazeau County, about 2 hours southwest of Edmonton. So the landowner approached us after attending one of the Living with Beaver workshops. She was indicating that she was having some flooding issues due to beaver dams that were in a natural area that was downstream and north of her private land. So this quarter here is her land. And just to the north here is a natural area. And so you can actually see that there's quite a bit of water that's being ponded due to beavers. And so we collaborated with the landowner, with the county, as well as with Alberta Parks to install 2 pond levelers in this location in 2008. And so there's 2 dams, one of which was actually north, right on, or just north of the private land. And so it was on public land in Alberta Parks. And so there was a very large, very old, and very well-established beaver dam there. And then further upstream, there was actually a smaller dam that had just been started to be built, probably just before we put these installations in. And so both of these dams were causing quite a bit of flooding on our landowner's land. So I will explain a little bit more about the installation in a few more slides. But first, I'm going to kind of go over some of the things we had to think about before installing the pond leveling devices. And so we knew that provincial and federal regulations were probably going to apply. We're working in permanent water bodies. We were also working in public land as well as private land. So the 3 regulations that we knew we would have to look into would be the Water Act, the Public Lands Act, and the Federal Fisheries Act. We also needed to see and make sure that the dam was currently active. If beavers are no longer in the area or no longer maintaining the dam in question, there's a very strong likelihood that the pond leveler is going to be ineffective, because we really rely on the beaver to pack in the mud and sticks around the pond leveling device once it's installed. It's kind of the last stage. And if there's no beavers around to do this pond leveling device is likely to fail, as well as the whole dam itself is likely to fail, and probably sooner than later. So we really do need to make sure that it's active. We needed to consider the timing of the install. It's important that you don't drop water levels to a point where there's not enough water in the pond for the beavers to survive the winter. So generally they need about 3/4 to 1 meter of water, and that just ensures that the water is not going to freeze all the way to the bottom, because they don't hibernate, and they do need to be able to get in and out of their lodge in order to eat. And so if you drop the water levels too much, or if you drop the water levels too close to winter, you might inadvertently end up killing off your beavers through winter kill. Another thing to consider is you want to take a look around to see if there's a food cache that is being started to build up. So this is their food source during the winter. And if you see that there is a food cache, so it's usually just a big kind of messy pile of sticks and branches that are in the water, you might just want to wait until the next summer or next fall in order to install that pond leveling device. Other things you want to keep in mind about the timing of the install is the breeding bird window. So there's the Migratory Birds Convention Act. And so you just want to make sure, especially if you're using any machinery at all, that you're kind of outside of the breeding bird window. And then you also want to think about fish windows as well. And then you also want to think about how you're going to accomplish the installation. If you are just going to be going in and using rakes and shovels in order to kind of hand pull that dam out just enough to put the pond leveling device in, it'll probably not require as many permits as if you're trying to bring in machinery, any heavy machinery. It will probably change the types of regulations that apply. So on the regulatory side of things, this is kind of how we approached it. So cows and fish, we helped the landowner and the county in inquiring about the regulatory approvals. And so the first one was the Water Act. We were dealing with water, so we knew that we had to look into it. And so we communicated with Alberta Environment and Park staff. We let them know, we sent them detailed information about the pond leveling device, how we were planning on install it. And they got back to us and said, hey, you're working on a beaver dam. This is actually exempt under the Water Act, so you don't need to worry about approvals for this under this act. So this is what Jason was talking about earlier, is that beaver dams on private land are usually exempt under the Water Act. We also talked to folks at Alberta Parks and Alberta Environment and Parks about the Public Lands Act. So again, we told them what we were intending, how we were about to do it, and they let us know that no, there's no no temporary field authorization that was required. We also got permission from Alberta Parks in order to install the pond leveling device on public land within the natural area. And then finally, Fisheries Act. So at the time, there was a self-assessment tool that was available online, and it asked a series of questions about what type of project you were doing, what the expected negative outcomes would be. And through that self-assessment process, it was determined that no request for a review was required for this particular project. Having said that, the Fisheries Act has since changed, and I will speak about that shortly as well. And then it's all important to know that you always need to check with your local regulators, because even though we got these answers for this project, these actually we haven't always gotten the same answers in different parts of the province. So you always need to make sure that you're finding the right people to talk to. So once we had our responses about the approvals, we were able to go ahead with the install. So we installed 2 pond leveling devices into 2 different dams. And the workshop took place in September of 2018. So don't let this snow fool you. This is indeed mid-September, not even late September. So it was a bit of a surprise. And so this is part of our community of practice workshop. So we had folks from different municipalities, adjacent municipalities, and different organizations that wanted to learn how to install these devices, because they wanted to implement these devices within their municipalities or on their land. And so the folks that were there included a variety of county staff. We had an Alberta Parks staff member help us out, as well as the landowner. We also learned that, well, we knew that these devices are not maintenance free, but even though we were trying to find the ways to coexist with the beavers, they don't always want to coexist with us. So less than a week after the installation, the wily critters plugged up the downstream end of one of the devices. And since then, we've learned this seems to be a little bit more common when there's a series of dams on a water body. So this is a photo that the landowner sent us a few days later. And so the next week, my colleague Carrie and I went back out, and of course it snowed once more. And so we pulled all the mud and sticks out and secured an angle kind of panel cage on the downstream end of the pipe, just to make sure that they can't get sticks and mud into that downstream end of the pipe. And so far, this seems to be holding. And so after the installation, this is what it looked like. You can see right here, this is the pile of sticks as the downstream end. And this is what it looked like in just last summer. So it's holding up quite well. We try and get out to the devices every year just to make sure that they're still working. And this was the larger downstream dam. So you can see the water coming out here. And now it's nice and vegetated. And again, water is still flowing through both. The pond levels have gone down behind the dam, behind both dams. But water is still able to flow through, so they're still holding and doing what we expect them to do. So, as I alluded to earlier, since the installations, this was done in 2018, some things have changed on the regulatory side. First, through conversations that we have had with folks at the Public Lands Office, we have since learned that we need to be applying for public lands approval. So this is either a temporary field authorization or a TFA, or Department License of Occupation, or DLO, in order to be installing these structures. So as Jason was saying, these structures are being installed within the bed and shore of water bodies, and therefore is Crown owned. And so we now need to be applying for either TFA or DLO. We have yet to go through the application process for either of these. We're aiming to get through them this summer, so I can't really comment on the timelines or the application process at this time. Second, the Fisheries Act has recently changed. So in the summer of 2019, and the self-assessment tool is no longer available. So Jason mentioned that there is a code of practice for the beaver dam removal. However, it is quite vague, and we don't really know how to interpret it in terms of what it means for coexistence devices. So we are just kind of treating it as it's not applicable to the coexistence devices. And we're currently applying for a request for review through the Fisheries Act for these devices. So last summer we applied for two, or we helped another municipality apply for two of these requests for reviews for two different projects. And both reviews came back just with best practice recommendations, like working outside of the restricted activity period for fish and making sure you're controlling any sediment that may be entering the water, but no further permits were required. So the timeline for response was about 3 months. So make sure you're giving yourself lots of time for these permits to come back. And as I said before, you always want to make sure that you're checking in with your local regulators every time, because each project is a little bit different, so you might get a different answer. So to sum things up, on the regulatory side, all things change. So don't assume that you know the answer. The same questions in different parts of the province may yield different answers depending on who you talk to. So make sure you're finding the right person to talk to and make sure you're getting all the answers that you need. If you've asked a question, but you didn't hear back or didn't get the right answer or didn't get a full answer, make sure you ask again. And it doesn't hurt to ask if you can get it in writing. On the beaver side of things, they are wily little critters. They never cease to surprise and amaze us, even if they do try and work against us sometimes. But if we can learn to understand them just a bit better and learn to work with them, then the goal is that we can hopefully have a happy or at least tolerated coexistence. So this is me and my colleague Carrie. After the fix-up, we were wet and muddy and cold, and so we decided we were going to make a snow beaver. And on that, that's it for me. So thank you very much to all of you for being here today, and thanks to our funders and supporters for the Beaver project. And on that note, I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Tanya. It was good to see an update on that project, and reminds us about there are a lot of potential complexities on the regulatory side too, obviously. So the first question that's for you actually was about not the pond leveler installation, but about the paint and sand example you provided. So the question was, should you use regular exterior paint when you're doing that sand painting deterrent?
That's an excellent question. I personally have not been involved in any of the sand painting yet. There is an example of a project that got started in the city of Calgary within Fish Creek just last summer. Miriam, do you happen to know what kind of paint they used?
Yeah, it was regular latex, latex being, of course, considered inert once it's dried. And certainly if there's time later, Holly can talk about it. There is a chat, in the chat, we've posted a link to that for others that want to see the results of that. Because we don't have a lot of time because it doesn't affect the regulatory aspect today, but for people who want that, they can definitely look. There's a video which Holly built as well, and we can talk more about that if there's time later. So that's a great question. And because there are lots of tools that don't necessarily relate to the regulatory side to think about for sure, which was good for you to remind that kind of package of options. Maybe one of the other ones you could talk about was, you mentioned, of course, working with the counties and the landowners. How have the landowners, I guess, been involved in the process of applying or deciding what needed to be applied for, compared to, say, the other folks who work for organizations or agencies?
It really depends on the project. It depends on the landowners. We have had certain kind of collaborations where the county has kind of taken it all on themselves to do the application process, because it is quite daunting. And so generally municipalities are in a better position in order to apply for these types of applications. But we do also have some where landowners are kind of leading the way, but usually it's a collaboration kind of between all three of us.
Right, great. One more question for you, and we'll move on to our next speaker. Again, I'm not sure if you think you can answer this. If you can, we'll do so, or others will defer to our other speakers. In the case of an emergency, like say significantly, unexpected flooding affecting a crop or a road or other infrastructure, what other kind of nature-friendly interim steps could be taken while waiting for a 3-month time period if you haven't got approvals. Any thoughts on that?
Hand breach. So if it's a dam that's in question, especially if it's on private land, as Jason said, it is exempt from the Water Act. And if you're not using any machinery and you're just kind of going down with your hands and a rake, you can breach the dam that way. If you've got beavers that are active, probably they'll have built it up overnight. But I have heard of people that's kind of a weekly event. Some folks have made a family time out of it, that every Sunday afternoon they're going to go and breach the dam. So that's a kind of a high level, a lot of effort sort of way of managing it. But if it's only for a short amount of time, then maybe that's something that you can look into.
Great, thanks, Tanya. That's good. More questions to come on those, but thank you so much. That was really great. I'm gonna ask Holly to. Great, thank you so much, Tanya. I got carried away paying attention and was not turning myself back on. So one of the questions that I have for you is, you mentioned it a few times, but could you explain what is a fish window?
Okay, so the fish window is also known as a restricted activity period. And so different water bodies have different types of fish that live in them, and that have very particular, that these fish are particularly sensitive at particular times of year, whether they're spawning or if there's migration. And so each water body will have a restricted activity period associated with it. And so that's something you just need to keep in mind when you're doing any sort of work in any sort of water body in Alberta.
Great, thank you. So this question is about sort of access to information on the Fisheries Act federally. So who specifically would you contact for information about pond levelers and the Fisheries Act?
That's a good question. So we were partnering with a county last year, and our partner at the county was the one that had kind of just sent an email to Fisheries and Oceans. I believe that there's a contact on their website. And so if you have any specific questions, you can refer to their website and see if you can find a contact there.
Right, or I guess the alternative is to go through the request for review process, and they'll assign somebody to the questions, so to speak.
Right, yes, exactly. Yeah, but yeah, that's a good way to do it as well.
Okay, great. Just looking at the other questions, I think maybe one, if you could explain a little bit more about, did you, I guess, see or have you observed any differences in terms of applying the exclusion fences and the combo devices? You talked mostly about the case study that's the pond leveler, but you did mention the other aspects. Any regulatory sort of tweaks you think are of note that you'd want to tell people that are different or should definitely be the same? I know you said you thought they mostly fell under the same considerations.
So the biggest difference is that the exclusion fences, there is a part that actually physically sits on the bottom of the water body. And so for that reason, I would expect that since, as Jason was talking about, that any permanently naturally occurring water body, the bed and shore is public land essentially. So that if it is sitting on the bottom, it is sitting on the bed and shore, so that public lands would apply in that instance. So I would definitely be talking to somebody at the public lands office.
Right, okay. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, I think, and save the rest of the questions because there's quite a few more, Tanya, for you and for Jason. And I'll hold them for till our next speaker, and then we all get together again and do more questions. So thank you very much, Tanya, that was great. So I'll ask Holly, our next speaker, to bring her presentation and her video up. So while she's doing that, welcome, Holly.
Thank you.
Holly Kinnis is the conservation analyst with Mistaki Institute. Her work at Mistaki focuses on providing research support across a really wide variety of areas, including human-wildlife coexistence, which is where this beaver coexistence stuff falls, citizen science for conservation, municipalities and conservation, conservation planning and policy, and private land conservations. Prior to her work there, she has worked in environmental consulting as well for 2 years on wildlife projects in both Alberta and BC. She's worked on our collaborative Beaver project since she started with Mistaki in 2016, and Holly will tell you a little bit more about that since I didn't introduce it much at the beginning at all. So I'll turn it over to you, Holly. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Noreen, for that great introduction. So the Mistaki Institute is a nonprofit charitable applied research institute, and we're affiliated with Mount Royal University located in Calgary, Alberta, which is where I'm situated at now. We do research that is accessible to communities and decision makers so that they can make choices that promote healthy landscapes. So as Noreen mentioned, our Beaver collaborative with cows and fish began in 2012. And the goal of this collaborative is to foster coexistence with beavers so that we can see their ecological benefits on the landscape. So we do this by hosting educational workshops, hands-on coexistence tool workshops, like Tanya was just mentioning, hosting beaver symposiums. We've been doing this every second year, and then research of the use of coexistence tools. So right now, some of the research that we're undertaking as a collaborative is we're putting together a research paper that really documents the challenges to using beaver coexistence tools in Alberta. So in this paper, we describe 4 coexistence tools and the challenges for their use, and then we provide recommendations on how those challenges can be overcome. So I'm going to go over each of these tools, some in more detail than others. So first, we have our pond leveler, which we are now all very familiar with, as Tanya just provided a great case study on those. So for the pond levelers, some cases that we're aware of as a collaborative, and as Tanya explained, when our collaborative talks about these cases, a lot of the time we're not the ones applying for the applications. So we'll partner with the proponent or the landowner, whether that be a municipality, a private landowner, Crown land, and they will be the ones who are responsible for the applications. So when I talk about a lot of these cases, that's kind of what we're hearing it from, and that's our experience. So some of the conditions that we have heard of being applied for pond levelers to get approval are a fish and fish habitat assessment conducted by a qualified aquatic environmental specialist. And regarding the Public Lands Act, as Tanya mentioned, typically it's either a temporary field authorization or department license of occupation permit for work within the bed and shore. We have also heard of some cases in some parts of the province where no approvals or permits have been needed when they've spoken with the Alberta Environment and Parks office. And as Tanya also mentioned, with the recent changes in federal regulations to the Fisheries Act, a project review by Fisheries and Oceans is likely required for these. So some of the challenges to the use of a pond leveler as a coexistence tool is that there's still a lot of lack of awareness on the function and the purpose of the tool. There's a lack of clarity and some regional variation on the applicability of the legislation and the permits. And when a permit is required, there's uncertainty on what requirements or conditions are needed for that approval. Tanya also mentioned culvert protectors or an exclusion fence. So here's some more images for you as well. So I won't go too much into detail with how they actually work. But since culvert protectors are installed in stream, it's likely that they would require a permit under the Alberta Water Act or the Public Lands Act, similar to a pond leveler. Same with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans project review. That being said, to our knowledge, we're not aware of any approvals that have been required to install a culvert protector on either private or public land in the past. That's not to say that they're not needed now. As Tanya said, things always change. There's some regional differences, so it's always best to check. As she mentioned as well, sometimes these culvert protectors are combined with pond levelers, and so in that case, whatever permit or approval was needed for the pond leveler this would also fall under that category as well, since they're combined together. So similar to the challenges that the pond leveler was seeing with the use of this tool, with culvert protectors, there's a lack of awareness on the function and the purpose of this tool. There's a lack of clarity, and there's some regional variation on how the legislation and permits are applied in the use of this tool. And when those permits are required, there is uncertainty on the conditions needed for the approval. So the next tool is a little bit different. This is a beaver dam analog, a BDA, beaver mimicry, it's sometimes called. And so this is a tool where humans take the role of being a beaver. So we actually create a leaky, simple dam structure that goes across the stream, and it's usually installed in series along the stream length. So typically, this tool is used for restoration of riparian habitat and to increase the water storage potential of an area. This increased habitat can also encourage beaver to return, and it's a nice alternative to relocation, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And some projects that are making use of this tool, BDAs are being used quite readily in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And this tool is being used specifically for species at risk habitat restoration. So there's a lot of projects right now working on it with imperiled trout species, as well as sage grouse habitat creation. So in 2018, our Beaver Collaborative pursued a BDA pilot project to determine the effectiveness of this tool at enhancing habitat so that beavers would naturally return to an abandoned site. This was an alternative to relocation. A site was selected on public Crown land in southern Alberta. So the table that I have on the next few slides outlines the regulatory process that we experienced with trying to get a BDA installed. So under the Water Act, our pilot project was actually deemed to be a series of impoundments. We had to create a mitigation plan to ensure that there would be no negative impacts to downstream water licenses for users, as the South Saskatchewan River Basin is a closed basin, meaning that all water is already allocated to those users. So as Jason mentioned, you can't go in and steal the water away from someone downstream. And so that was how our project was viewed. So our project and a lot of the permit requirements were actually quite similar. It was treated similarly to a destructive activity. So the challenges to use of this tool were the same as all the other ones. There was a lack of awareness on the function and purpose. This tool, there's only been 2 other cases of this tool being used in Alberta, and there was a large variation in the requirements of what they needed to go through for the processes to install those BDAs compared to the process that we experienced. And then when permits were required, there was a lot of uncertainty as to what requirements or conditions were needed for approval. So as a result of the complex regulatory requirements, we concluded that BDAs are not a feasible coexistence tool for Alberta landowners at this point in time. So the last tool that we looked at in our research paper was relocation. So relocation is the intentional human-assisted movement of wildlife from one location to another. So this can be a really useful tool for beaver management in a variety of situations, including for a non-lethal control of a problem beaver, where it alleviates undesirable beaver activities while you can still augment beaver into another area where they want beavers to be relocated to for habitat restoration purposes. And then this can also help recolonize areas as well. So based on communications with landowners, we are aware, sorry, that relocation is occurring in Alberta without any regulation or oversight. So unregulated relocation of beavers is quite dangerous due to complexities relating to animal welfare, disease transmission, and social tolerance at the recipient location. Currently in Alberta, there is no clear policy for beaver relocation, but landowners can apply for a permit under the Wildlife Act and associated regulations, but this must be authorized through a collection license. According to the Wildlife Act regulations, any relocations that occur should be only considered if the IUCN criteria for wildlife relocations is met. The challenge, however, with this is that there are no real clear policies or regulations in Alberta that specify what this criteria is, what it looks like, and the relocation applications are also approved on a case-by-case basis, which we've heard can be quite a lengthy process. Another route for relocation is that a research permit can be applied for for the needs of researching relocation. So that's another way that relocation can be permitted. And we are not aware of any cases of landowners actually using a collection license or a research permit for relocation of beavers. We are aware of one case of a research permit being used on a conservation area where they relocated beavers to that site because they were hoping to recolonize a population on their property. So the common challenges that we found amongst the 4 beaver coexistence tools are the lack of clarity and regional variation on applicable legislation and permits. Like I said, when the permits are required, there's uncertainty on what conditions are needed for that permit approval. There's a poor availability of information on permit requirements for landowners and land managers, including municipalities. So it's quite hard to find when you do find it, and I've been looking quite hard. There's little emphasis on coexistence on the Government of Alberta website. They have a webpage specifically to beavers and how to deal with beaver challenges. There's a lack of awareness and training of beaver coexistence tools among government staff, including a lack of awareness of the benefits of beaver coexistence. More broadly, there is also a history and culture among landowners and land managers for treating beavers as a pest species. So we suspect that this has led to some social resistance for considering coexistence. But don't give up hope yet. I'm not going to leave you on that note. So we've developed a set of recommendations that we hope can address some of these challenges to make beaver coexistence tools a much more readily used option in Alberta. So our recommendations, we kind of broke into 2 categories. The first being the creation of an Alberta beaver management plan. So we want to prepare this, or this should be prepared with all relevant stakeholders having a place at the discussion table. There should be an emphasis on coexistence. This beaver management plan should incorporate ecosystem goals. So how can beavers help us with species at risk recovery or wetland restoration? A jurisdictional review to determine what other jurisdictions are doing with regards to their beaver management. There's a lot of work in this field going on right now, especially in the United States. Identify a strategy to make permit and approval requirements much more clear, so that when you're a landowner and you want to install a pond leveler, you know exactly what you need to do and who you need to talk to. Include a strategy to make beaver coexistence an integral part of the beaver management information that's provided by the Government of Alberta. And additionally, we'd like to identify some exemptions and potentially codes of practice for common restoration techniques, and also to include continued education and awareness on the benefits of beavers and how we can coexist with them. So bringing it back specifically to the landowner and the land manager, what do you need to ask when you want to use these coexistence tools? Do I need a permit or approval for this tool? And what do I need to provide to obtain this permit or approval? Those are very important questions. And I want to recommend that you start the process early. It can take weeks to months to get some of these permits and approvals in place. And who do you need to ask? So we would recommend calling your local Alberta Environment and Parks Office to determine what permits or approvals are needed in your specific area. Like we said, it changes quite often, so it's best to check with your local representative. And then also contact Fisheries and Ocean Canada. We've said this a few times, there's a submit for a request for review for your project. I believe that's a pretty straightforward online application process when I've seen it in the past. So I think that's the best way to get a contact at Fisheries and Oceans. And then there is this interim code of practice for beaver dam removal. We're not quite sure how it might be applied in some pond leveler situations. So it's always best to submit that request for review for your project. I just quickly want to thank our funders, the Alberta Government's Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program, as well as the Calgary Foundation. And then I want to point you to our collaborative Beaver website. So that's rockies.ca/beavers. And I think it'll be in the chat as well. So on that website, there's a lot of great resources, as well as the mailing list that you can sign up for right on the homepage. And once we're done, our Beaver Coexistence Tools paper, we'll be sending that out across the mailing list, and that'll probably it'll probably be wrapped up in the next week or two here. So I'll keep you on the edge of your seats, and you can wait for that to come out. I'll now pass it back to Noreen.
Great, thank you very much, Holly. There are lots of questions related to beavers coming in, so I'm going to pose a couple to you, and then I'm going to ask the rest of our panel to join us as well. So I think this is a straightforward answer, but is there any time frame for the Alberta Beaver Management Plan you mentioned to be created?
I don't think it will be a quick process. We kind of have it on our timeline, hopefully within the next year and a half. But I mean, there's a lot of moving pieces to that. So we do have it on our radar, and hopefully that's coming in the next couple of years.
Right, and it does depend if grant funding is provided and the other people that need to participate agree that it's something of importance right now. So another one for you is the lack of clarity that you mentioned among the regulators who are doing their approvals, or is it among the people who are applying, or is it both?
I would say it's a bit of both. Some of these tools are pretty new to the Alberta landscape. And so they are new to the people applying. And so they're not quite sure what to expect when it comes to the application process. And then they're also new to the approval staff. So the Alberta Environment and Park staff that would be looking at those applications as well. So they are also not as familiar with that tool as they would be for some other applications. So they're not quite sure, you know, what conditions are in place or should it be adhered to, because they're not specifically mentioned in the legislation.
Right, absolutely. So another question for you, and after this question, I'm going to start posing them to both yourself and Tanya and Jason. So if you guys want to rejoin us, that'd be great. So has any organization consolidated historic and current locations of beaver populations, including dams and lodges, on public land in the eastern slopes? And if so, are there any efforts to prioritize locations as possible reintroduction locations for beavers?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I hope my feedback isn't too bad. I think it always tones down after you speak a few words. Historically, we don't really have estimates of numbers of beavers in specific regions. Historically, based on fur trade times, there was a 90% reduction in the population of beavers across North America. But what I can speak to a little bit is our current population of beavers. So several years ago, our Beaver Collaborative did do some work with the Allseas group to do some modeling to try to figure out not so much the current population of beavers. We did look at dams and lodges, but it was more from a water storage and capacity potential of, if we had enough beavers on the stream segment, how much water could we store? So that was, I believe, in southern Alberta. And then the next phase of our Beaver project, which, funding permitting, will hopefully be starting in the next few months here. We're hoping to run a tool called the BRAT modeling tool. So It's the Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool, and it can actually help us determine the carrying capacity of streams. So how many beavers could live on a stream segment. And we're hoping to, I guess, ground truth. You can't really see my fingers when they float away in the dam. Ground truth that model with a citizen science project that will help us count some dams and lodges. So from that, we should hopefully be able to get an estimate of beaver population, but also water storage potential.
Great, thank you very much, Holly. Yeah, there's lots of upcoming potential pieces in the work we're doing together. So more to come on those. I'm going to ask the next question of, I think I'll suggest, Jason, you answer this first if you can, and otherwise others can jump in. But does a municipality always have to submit a request for review to DFO if they're using explosives? Do you know the answer to that question?
I can only speak to what the code of practice says, that the interim code of practice excludes using explosives. So I would recommend requesting a review in that case, because they don't have an interim code of practice for the use of explosives for that purpose, as far as I'm aware. So, right.
Thank you. This next question is again regulatory details, but I'm going to combine a couple questions because they're overlapping. I'll ask maybe Jason, you to chime in first, and then ask Tanya or Holly to add to it if you'd like. So this is kind of about the bulk of the work in transportation and municipalities. There's so many roads, so many culverts. Is there basically any option to not apply for every single item, as in every single time that a beaver is going to cause a plugged culvert under a road, when you have to keep your roads open, you have to repair them, you have to have safe motoring public opportunities. And you know, one of the questions Stephen says, we have a bunch of pond levelers and culverts, but what are we supposed to do? Apply and get 3 months waiting time potentially with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans or others for every single thing, when that's not really realistic. So are there any exemptions for both the federal or the Provincial Water Act or public lands that you guys can comment on? And I'll ask Jason to comment on that if you have any ideas.
Sure. The so Fisheries Act, so the prohibitions, you want to keep that forth in your mind, at the forefront of your mind, if I can say that. But there is an interim code of practice as well for maintenance of culverts, I believe. So checking the DFO site and seeing the interim code of practice and how it directs you to mitigate or avoid the harmful alteration type of actions. The water ministerial regulation also has exemptions related to maintenance of culverts of certain sizes. So it may depend on those sizes, but and how it applies to a specific culvert, you'd have to look at the regulations there. And then the Public Lands Act, typically there might be a requirement for a field authorization depending on what you're doing. But typically some of the occupancy type of stuff should have been dealt with before, but often it's maybe not. So the license of occupation, if there is one needed, that might be required if it was never obtained in the first instance. Some of the challenges is that we have a lot of stuff on the landscape that was never approved to begin with. So how that plays into it is a challenge for sure, because you might have to go back and say, well, we have this and it never was approved. Can we get it approved now? In which case you do want to get those systems approved in the first instance. So. Oh, you're on mute.
Anything either of the other of you would like to add?
Yeah, I would, if you have any questions, if there's any uncertainty at all, just find someone to talk to. Christy, you just posted in the chat that there's a contact us page for DFO, and you might be able to, so if you can talk to someone from the local office, like they should be able to give you at least some clarity on that. And same with your Public Lands or Water Act, just find someone within the government to talk to, and they should be able to give you an answer. Because yeah, if it's going to be an ongoing, constant thing all the way throughout the municipality, then hopefully that there, yeah, something could be, you can come to some sort of agreement. But yeah, if ever you're in any doubt, just find someone to talk to.
Yeah, and I think our observation in the past is that a lot of municipalities either have or at least have the impression that they have a long-standing, almost like a permit that gives them sort of authorization to do those kinds of activities to maintain roadways. But I think this is to Jason's point. Sometimes we have old things that we assume are the case. So it's probably really a good opportunity to say, if you don't actually know where that authorization or permit is, make sure you do and find it. And if it doesn't exist, then you might need to start the process. And I do know from working with some of the municipalities that we have, and Holly can add to this, that they do sometimes have, I'll say bulk. They have a group of situations and sites combined in permitting. The City of Calgary example, I think, comes to mind that we've worked with, where, but you shouldn't assume that just because you're a municipality, that's already in place, or that you just have the authority to do that. And so it is pretty important to make sure that you're, whatever those criteria are going to be in your situation, that you look into it. Kind of moving to a rather different question. I think maybe I'll ask Tanya to answer this first. One of the later questions. So beavers have recently moved into a creek that divides one landowner's quarter section and their subdivided acreage neighbor, and they're hoping to come to a compromise, which for this person's desire is to sacrifice some of the trees to benefit the beaver, and for the neighbor it's to sacrifice the beaver to save some of the trees. So I think that compromise might involve harvesting, meaning trapping or shooting, some of the beavers. Is there any advice on how to do that responsibly? And what does a sustainable beaver harvest look like? Like, how would you do that best?
That's a really good question. My first comment would be to speak to the municipality, wherever you're living, that usually the municipality has a trapper either on staff or as a contractor. And they would be the person to talk to that would have the best methods for collecting and harvesting. And they would also probably have the best knowledge as to what would be the sustainable harvest within that particular area, because it'll be different throughout the province depending on beaver populations overall. Other methods that you could also kind of explore would be if your neighbor has trees that he really doesn't want the beavers to be taking down, like if it's a particular stand of trees or whether it's a particular just like couple of trees, you could look into wrapping those trees with wire. Or you could look into some of the sand painting. So this is just mixing paint and sand and then painting your tree, and the grittiness of that sand kind of really deters the beavers from chopping it down. So I guess it depends on the number of trees that you're hoping to, or your neighbor is hoping to save. So those are another couple of options that you could look into as well.
Anything you would like to add to that, Holly?
No, I think Tanya did a great job. I just point you to our Collaborative Beaver website if you are looking for some tree protection methods. We have a great video on there from the City of Calgary on how to properly wire a tree, because there's particular materials that work and some that don't, aka chicken wire doesn't work very well. So don't be putting that on your trees. And then there's also some information on the exact tree painting methods that we piloted recently. So.
Right. And following up on your comment, Tanya, and yours, Holly, during your presentation about the humane handling is partly what makes a good, if you're either relocating or killing a beaver to remove it because it's in a problem area, is thinking about these are monogamous individuals that have young. So you want to think about, if you're removing, them at a certain time of the year, you want to think about humane considerations that relate to that. So there's a couple more questions here I'd like to try to get to. We're just pretty much out of time. So there is a comment that I think I'm going to maybe ask Holly and Tanya to chime in on, which is, have our Cows and Fish and our collaborative or others developed a consultation process that includes disposition holders, meaning grazing leaseholders on public land, or FMA, like forestry permit holders of various kinds, in reintroducing beavers? So working with the people that have the other dispositions, what experience would there be so far, if we have any? And do you guys want to add anything to that?
We take that. We haven't actually done any work with relocation, so that's a really good question, because that's interesting.
Sure, I'll just add in from some of the South stuff. I think it's similar to the work we're doing elsewhere on non-beaver things, is that, you know, you do definitely need to have those conversations, but also the possibility, I guess, is that there's less private landowners to be affected by a beaver being relocated, but it doesn't mean there's less impacts, because there's lots of potential roads, infrastructure, whether that's logging, oil and gas, grazing, fences, all kinds of other things that for sure, and trail systems for recreation that would need to be part of this sort of decision. And that's one of the reasons we've done no relocations, in addition to all the reasons that Holly has mentioned in her talk.
Yeah, we did, just to add to that. Ooh, my audio is a little crazy on my end. I don't know if it's bad. But with the BDA site, it was on public land, but there was a grazing leaseholder on that as well. So we did, it's obviously not a relocation, although I think the grazing leaseholder would have been happy to have a relocated beaver, because he wants more beavers back to his grazing lease for the water benefits. So we did, there wasn't like a formal consultation process, but we worked with them throughout the whole process. They helped us select a site, that sort of thing. So it's definitely a needed aspect, no matter what work you're doing, whether it's relocation, beaver related, riparian restoration related.
Right, for sure. Thank you for adding that, Holly. There's a comment to add to the discussion about sustainable harvest or safe harvest from a pond from one of our participants, that you can accurately, I guess if you have the knowledge, at least accurately estimate the number of beavers that are in a pond by judging the number of eras the beaver have been present, meaning multiple sort of generations and different evidence, I think, from the dams that are old as well as new, and whether they have an abundance of food as well as if anyone has done management on them thus far, meaning removal of other kinds. So generally you'll see 4 kits born each spring. And, you know, thinking about sort of, you know, one of the things we've observed, and certainly the research shows, if you keep removing beavers where there's great habitat, there's still an opportunity for new beavers to move back in. So thinking about, if you're going to do removal, keep the maternal and pair there, possibly, and think about removing the young, or you know, because new beavers start new work in a lot of cases too, right? So we are at the end of our time. There's still a few more questions. I'm sorry we can't cover any more, but we do need to do a couple of wrap-up things we wanted to show you, and I will ask our support person, Jonathan, who's behind the scenes, to launch our poll while I move on to the last couple of slides, because we really want your feedback. Thank you so much to our presenters for all the great questions, and all the participants for posing them. Please tell us, did you learn something today? And will what you learned today influence your activities or the work that's related that you do to this topic? So please answer the 2 questions in the poll and hit submit when you're done. And while that's going, please do fill it in. I'm going to just bring up my presentation. And I'll just ask my colleagues to tell me if you're seeing the agenda slide. Great. So yeah, I'll give it another few seconds for those of you that haven't filled in the poll to let us know how we did today. And for those of you that want to go look at the recordings from other sessions, just a reminder that you can do that and go to our YouTube channel and see the recordings from past sessions, and the link is on your website. If you Google Cows and Fish YouTube channel, you should be able to get there. And it looks like from our results that Everybody that filled in the survey said yes, they did learn new information today, and almost everybody also said it is going to influence their management and their work in this area, and everybody else said it might. So that's great impact for our feedback as well as for to share with our funders. So thank you for letting us know that. We know that the activities that we all do on the landscape, and landowners and land managers and users decisions do affect the health of the landscape in riparian areas, of course, and elsewhere, and that provision of those ecological goods and services and functions. So if we can help make that most effective with understanding riparian regulations related to beaver coexistence, then we can of course help make that provision of ecological goods and services more sustainable. Our session today was supported, in addition to individual speakers, funders, by our funding from the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, Alberta Environment and Parks, and our members and supporters that make up Cows and Fishes Board. So we want to thank all of those organizations. And for those of you that like to reach out to the Environmental Law Centre or to Cows and Fish, you can do so through our websites, through our emails and phone numbers. And you can see that right now on your screen. So thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. If you want to reach out again and follow up with any of our speakers, please do. We'll look forward to seeing you on the next sessions. You'll find this recording in a few days posted. So thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you, guys. Thank you to all of our support team behind the scenes, Christy.